Thank you for joining us on this episode of MSP 1337, a podcast dedicated to helping MSPs and their clients navigate cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a journey, but it doesn't mean you have to travel alone. I'm your host, Chris Johnson, and before we get started, I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsor, Pinpoint Solutions, a consulting firm dedicated to providing cybersecurity leadership and guidance to MSPs and their clients. Think of us as your virtual CISO or security advisor. Head on over to pinpointsolutions.com to find out more. Now on with the show. Welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of MSP 1337. I'm joined this week by John Munford of, New London Community School District. Sorry. It is a school district in New London. Got it. All right. So just to recap, for those of you that have been following along, this is the part 2 of a 2-part series. Last week, we focused on how to evaluate vendors from the perspective of security and that long-term relationship that I think most of us look for when we start dealing with a vendor that's going to come in and work with us. You know, what's the short list? What are the criteria? We had the 5 big things that kind of stand out from an MSP perspective. And the big one that kind of stands out for me even still is, what frame of mind am I in when I do this evaluation? So this week I wanted to get perspective on sort of the same vendors potentially, but looking at it through the lens of, I'm the client and I have to make decisions that I don't have necessarily a third party who's helping me navigate this, who has experience with maybe a particular vendor across lots of clients like me. I'm sort of running solo. And so, John, you are the tech director for New London Community School District, has student population of what, 500, 600 kids?
About 600. Yeah, we're about 600 kids, K-12.
And about how many staff are you managing for support?
For support, it's just me for the entire district, and our staffing is probably 75.
Okay.
Teachers and everything.
Okay. So along those lines, and we talk about this a lot in the MSP space, is, you know, an MSP can have 3 to 5 employees that focus purely on what you are doing on a scale that in some cases is 3 times or 4 times what they're supporting when you think about the assets. So talk to me a little bit, John, about when you're looking at vendors from a cybersecurity standpoint. Obviously is my priority in this, but just kind of walk me through, like, what are like the top 3 or top 5 things that you're looking for when you're evaluating a new vendor or even auditing an existing vendor? Because obviously you started at some point at New London with vendors already in play.
Correct. Yep.
So let's talk about that as the second part, but let's talk about evaluating new vendors right now.
So one of the things that I try to do when I'm evaluating new vendors is just, I'm so bad at these, man. You should have sent me your
This
question.
is just a conversation. Pretend we're eating lunch.
Yeah, there we go. A lot of times I try to look at, gosh dang it, man. You should stop.
No, just keep going. We can edit stuff out.
It's so bad.
Let me give you a more pointed question.
There you go.
If you're evaluating a vendor, let's say it's a software vendor, or a software vendor specifically, as opposed to a hardware vendor. This is some organization that's going to have their software installed on maybe your staff laptops, on your servers, or maybe it's cloud-based and there's some sort of subscription model and you query out to a website. When you're talking to these vendors, what's the number one concern you have when you go and talk to them?
Probably my number one concern when I go and talk to them is just figuring out who owns the data and where it's sitting at. Also try to look at security practices within their software. You know, and something we discovered with Software Unlimited was some of their standard settings of being, you know, port 25 on sending emails and stuff like that. And so going through and evaluating all the way through on those sorts of things as well.
So that's actually a good example of a vendor that you don't necessarily have any evaluation control over, right? Like that you're going to get this vendor because they're one of maybe 2 players in the country that specializes in education, financial software.
And that was something that we talked about, you know, quite a bit, is what softwares do I actually have an opportunity to I can look at them, yes, but I don't actually have an opportunity to pick them because they're going to be picked anyways. And so on my back end, it's kind of seeing which ones are the least bad sometimes, out of our two options, or which ones, are more able to solve issues that we may arise, or a little bit more secure on that front.
So that's a good a way to sort of pitch it. I think about that too. So like we just are going through right now replacing our time clocks, and for those of you that I haven't said this before, I also work in a school district that's a few miles down the road from where John's located, which is why this made sense for us to have this conversation, because we spend a lot of time talking about these exact things over lunch as to why was I stuck with this, right? Mm-hmm. And I think the phrase that I hear more often than not, well, this is how we've always done it.
Right.
And change in a school district is quite a bit different than change, I think, in a lot of the private sector or even other government entities. It's like, if I'm not happy with it, we change it out. In an education system, it's like, well, we got to get buy-in from the entire administration office, or we've got to get the school board to buy in, and they've never even worked with the software in the first place. So there's criteria that's being used that's got no bearing.
A lot of the issue that we obviously talk about is, trying to explain to someone else why it's a big deal, because I know why some of these security issues are a big deal. And I know it's, where they're holding our data at's a big deal, or, whether it's in American data centers versus off-sea data centers, and all those things matter to us, but they don't matter to anyone else. And so it's hard a lot of times I've found to get buy-in on those sorts of things.
Well, that actually is one of the bullets. I mean, you didn't phrase it that way, but one of the bullet points I had from last week's was specifically of where is the data and what data do they actually have access to. So you've run into this, whether you're using Clever or ClassLink or any number of SIS systems to pull data out of, up until recently, we didn't have the means to do a good job of saying, I'm only going to send to you specific pieces of data. It was like, I'm sending you everything about my kids, everything about my staff, and please be nice with it. And then it goes back to what you said, like, where is here?
Right.
Even if I trust them, right? Like, where is it? So,
and a lot of times they don't host their own data centers. They're outsourcing to someone else because they don't actually need to have a data center. So you're just really talking with a middleman who is then trusting someone else on the back end of theirs. So
right. And they're not even sure. They're like, well, you guys are like the first we've ever worked with on something like this to integrate with that product. Let's just see what we can do. Let's hack it out. And you're like,
yeah.
Shouldn't we spend some time on this and make sure that it's okay?
Yeah.
So it's funny. So we're going at this from a completely different perspective, in my opinion, than an MSP who's looking into your organization versus you looking out. And so far we've literally talked for about 7-8 minutes, and two key points have come up that are the exact same criteria that were in the list from last week. And one of those was, where's my data? And who owns my data, right? Like, that's two key pieces. So I want to go back to a minute of, like, we'll say you don't have a choice on how bad or not bad a vendor might be. And I think that's, to some extent, I'd like to say it's not fair. And I say it's not fair because I think vendors have an obligation to create software that solves productivity and efficiency issues. They're not in the business of being security vendors. Now, while I would argue, and you would too, that they need to be security minded and security focused, our problem by and large is that in the education space, we're not educating the resources like you and I to make sure that we have a game plan, regardless of who the vendor is, to ensure that in my school district, it's being done in a secure manner. So where's the balancing act? I think there is one here where we say, well, whether it's Software Unlimited or somebody else, hey, you defaulted to an insecure port. It's like, well, if I do a secure port and it doesn't work, then you tell me my product's flawed. So to your point, who's responsible, do you think, from the education perspective?
Oh man, that's tough. I think we're ultimately responsible for making sure that we use a product that's good and secure. I mean, or if it's not working, with them on a solution to make it that way. Like, like we talked about before, there's not always an option. We don't have a chance whether we're using Software Unlimited or not.
Sure.
We in reality, we don't, and so we have to work on, figuring out how to fix those issues with them, or, maybe they would, maybe they have some things that they know that aren't quite done right or securely or in best practices, and figuring out how to fix those.
To some extent, it's like a parallel mindset, right? So you're like, I've got product X here, and it is going to stay here, and it is going to operate the way it does because that's the way it was built. But in order for me to sleep at night, I've got to come up with a new solution that sits, in parallel with this. It allows me to go in and say, this is how we're protecting that data, even though they aren't doing it themselves. And I think that's, quite honestly, that's probably one of the most common things you see right now, right? Like Salesforce, Google, you name it, they by default don't get turned on in a secure manner, because if they did, it wouldn't work out of the box, period. So like, for example, if you turn on two-step verification in Google and you turn on, turn it on is available or optional, or not optional, make it available to turn on, right? And then you hit the button enforce, no one can log in. Right. And the best part about it is this is a beautiful security thing, because it says each user is responsible for turning on their own two-step verification. And so when it's enforced, even an administrator can't go solve that user's problem without going back and turning off enforce for everybody.
Right.
It's beautiful.
Google should have had a tiered step there where they have like a require restriction or two-factor once they set it up. So instead of just locking everyone out, to allow an onboarding portal or something like that for the first time.
So they did add something. I noticed that when I went back in there, the ad is
quite a while.
Yeah. So the ad that's in there now is you can enforce after specific date, and then it checks a box that it says it basically lets the users know. So it's kind of like it's like with Microsoft getting the notification that your password's about to expire. It's kind of the same thing. Like, hey, you have 2 weeks to turn on two-step verification.
Yeah.
Luckily, it gives a link along with it, because good luck trying to find that on your own as a user.
And it's not super easy to set up for some of the staff members.
Well, and I think part of that goes back to this education component. And that's what makes, I think, working with vendors all that more difficult, particularly when vendors come into the education space that are not a native education focused product. They're not used to experience working with people that are like, what's two-factor authentication? I mean, it still exists in I'll call it the real world with private sector businesses that, haven't heard the term necessarily. But I think in education, we've done a really bad job of educating, because we're sheltering our own jobs from having to have that increase in help desk tickets and support requirements, which by and large is the byproduct of an administration that says we can't hire more resources anyway.
And then you are 1,000% correct on that. I am sometimes very selfish on making things like that a reality because of the workload I know it's going to put on me. Right. And like we talk about all the time, how stretched thin my resources are, because it's me and I do everything. I do management, I do construction, I do auditoriums, I do lighting, I do track, I do people, I do break fix. I mean, I do everything, Right. And so
if you don't know how to use a screwdriver as a tech director, you're out of a job.
Yeah. And I just don't have I just don't have the time sometimes to sit down and do these trainings like I really need to.
So I think that's something that maybe, I think we have some influence in this space that I think we probably need to spend more time and go back to the tech directors around us and really go, hey guys, if we don't band together and do this, we're going to be another statistic on the news like Berkeley was on the East Coast, or some of these other schools where it's like, and you think about it and you're like, well, were they hosted or on-prem with their, the data, the financial data or the student data? Yeah. And it's hard to say that it would have mattered based on some of how these attacks were done. And so, like I've had this conversation recently and I said, my staff is more concerned about accessibility of data than they are about the confidentiality of data. And I can get behind that all day long, because as soon as my staff lacks the ability to access the data, my job's miserable.
Correct.
Confidentiality, if it's not their priority, I can't force priority of that on them. I can only encourage them, right? I can bring them to water, but I can't make them drink. Two-step verification and some of this two-factor stuff, we can turn on now. We couldn't before, because the expectations are being driven by our vendors. So I'll add one that I think, and maybe you'll agree with this. I believe that there is expectation that I have, even if I don't always get it. When I go to a vendor, how are you enforcing security?
Mm-hmm.
The key word is enforce, not it's optional.
Right.
So like I can say, I think it's, I want to say Canvas. If you use Canvas as an LMS, they are now encouraging, because this fall, if you have administrative rights in Canvas, you will be forced to a two-factor authentication add, which is like awesome, because now I'm not doing it, right? I'm not the bad guy.
Yeah.
So anytime a vendor is willing to take the heat for being the bad guy on something that I would like to implement, that just makes me want to use them even more.
Right. And I have that conversation with a lot of people too. It's like, I would much rather make somebody else the bad guy, because you're not going to call and yell at Canvas. The teacher isn't going to call and get mad at Canvas for enforcing 2FA.
Right. And it's funny because I've been sort of like in the background trying to make little subtle changes to improve our overall security posture, and to the two-step verification bit me. Fortunately, not for very many people, but it's like, I got lucky because none of them were like, hey, this happened, it's your fault, because they didn't know that I did the change.
Right.
And so now I'm being asked like, hey, when are you going to tell everybody that this stuff is coming? And I'm like, if I tell everybody, then I have to field all of the questions that come with it. Right. Mm-hmm. So this comes back to, for me, I had this bullet that I was thinking about over the weekend. What is the vendor's process for training and education? Like, if I sign on for your product, what does onboarding look like? Is it a 2-hour virtual thing where I get one person trained on this? Or is it like you come on site over the course of a 2 or 3 day period, and everybody that needs to know becomes in the know?
And I think that question is a lot of times answered by how much dollars you have to throw at it, because you can get Canvas or any of those people to come on site for quite a bit of money. It's money that's probably more realistic for you than it is for me.
Sure. But then that raises a really important question. And it obviously goes back to, if they're doing it anyways, it's a tough win for you. But I think it's one of those things that in the conversation, when you evaluate a vendor's product, it's like, okay, for 10X, let's just say it's $10,000. Mm-hmm. It includes no training. But for 12.5, it includes all the training in the world. Right. I see over and over again where
that's easy buy.
Yeah, that might be. But I've also seen where they don't buy it because they're like, well, it's $2,500 and $2,500 covers XYZ product that's not in our budget this year.
Most of the ones that I've seen are like, and I don't know Canvas's prices exclusively, but it was like, buy a product for $3,000, or onboarding is a couple thousand for getting your data migrated or whatever. And you getting trained basically. And then it was another $20,000 to come on site. So it was some like factor of 5 to get them to come on site and do a couple of days worth of training or whatever.
But this gets into a good example of the illusion that I think is created by self. And when I say self, I mean like school districts, mm-hmm. the education space at large, that, hey, we can figure this out. And the answer of we can figure this out is tied to some other district using it. That's the wrong district to pick to call, because they're like, oh yeah, we didn't do the training. We didn't think we needed it. It worked out okay. Then you find out through the rumor mill. It's like, oh yeah, because the 2 people that were responsible for implementing it came from another district where they were full-time Canvas administrators.
Right, something like that.
Yeah. Right. So okay. So shifting gears a little bit. We've talked about sort of vendors in general. Looking at this from the inside out, are there vendors that you are like just looking for? And I don't mean specific named vendors, but like, are there things today that you are either curious about, need to get your hands on, you've got gaps in your organization that you want to solve from a cybersecurity perspective, that you're like, if I could get one piece addressed this year, it would be?
My answer to that question is going to be, I wish I could get a hold of some sort of pen tester type company to do some of these high level testing of the district, the network, and those sorts of things from a pen tester standpoint. How's that?
Well, I'm going to say you're talking to the right person right now. And not so much because I want to come do a pen test on you or some sort of vulnerability assessment, but I can tell you that through the primary audience of MSP-Ignite peer group members, mm-hmm. there's about 4 or 5 or more members that's what they do. They're focused pen testers. It's funny because one of the things that I always harp on is if you want a pen test, what does the policy look like that goes with that? So if you say, Chris, I'd like you to come in next week, do a penetration test. Can you do it between 8 and 10 o'clock in the morning? Oh, by the way, we're ISAPS testing. So, yeah, right. So what's interesting though, is a lot of organizations get stuck on, I need to do a penetration test. I want to see how well my infrastructure would hold up. You're like, well, okay, how much are you willing to spend to replace infrastructure if not only can we brute force through it, but we also compromise the integrity of the hardware so it can't be used anymore?
Right.
Or do you want to do more of like authenticated and vulnerability scanning where it's like your VLANs shouldn't be talking to each other, but for whatever reason at the router or firewall level, it's allowing traffic to route to that other VLAN. So that's a really, really good question. And I think
you're right. Maybe a penetration test isn't necessarily the proper word to use. Maybe it was more of a, somebody coming in and doing just kind of an overview.
Like a security audit.
Top level security audit, right? But for a price point that's not insane, and works for a school district that's 600 kids.
Right. So that's a really interesting sort of segue on evaluating vendors. I think this is a good place to sort of, I don't want to say wrap up the whole podcast, but I think that this next sort of 10 minutes or so, let's talk about what does it mean to evaluate vendors from the perspective of a specific need. So talking about pen test or vulnerability assessment, I think that's a really, I don't want to say it's an easy one, but that's one that's pretty tangible, right? We know someone's going to come in, do something, right? But like, talk to me about, like, say, evaluating something like an AWS environment versus putting something in your own environment for like Adobe Creative Suite or, maybe your AutoCAD type applications. What process do you go through when you do that type of vendor evaluation to determine what makes the most sense?
So I've been on both sides of that fruit. So I had a AutoCAD lab that was aging, and we wanted to age it out because it was getting to that point where it was needing to go. And I decided to set up some AWS instances and ran them on AppStream 2, which actually worked really well for quite a while. And in that process, we obviously had a couple samples set up, and it worked really great, in the smaller samples and stuff. But when you scale up, it just wasn't as seamless for all of my users as I had wished.
Sure.
And so I wish that I had taken more time on my side. I wish I would have taken more time to do actually, kind of maybe multi-user, maybe 20, 30 simultaneous users logged in. And it was good, but not great. And so then we actually ended up coming back and doing on-site hardware, but a lot of that was led by cost.
Sure.
And available funding for replacing those computers at a cost of, we're talking sometimes $1,000, $1,500 a computer for those particular ones.
Which is another interesting conversation point on security and vendors. So I'm kind of looking at this, coming into the district that I'm in. I've been here, this is my third year, so I've got official tenure, right? 3 years in. One of the things I ran into is I've got PCs and computers that, are decade plus old.
Right.
And I get this argument of like, well, it's not in our budget to put computers in the classroom. I'm like, well, is it in our budget to put computers in a lab? Yeah. Is it in our budget to replace those labs on a consistent cycle? Yes. I'm like, well, why don't we make an actual policy that says, as we cycle devices through a lab, there's a 2-year cycle of those machines going into a classroom, but we've got to have an intentional, like, it's not staying in that classroom 3 lab cycles. And that was a really tough conversation because I think education has something that no other vertical has. The uniqueness of each classroom environment is just that. It's a snowflake. And so when we come in and use
everyone's a snowflake.
Right. But the carte blanche of like, we're not Windows or we're not Mac or we're going to be all, it doesn't always work. And it goes back to that vendor evaluation process. So you're either evaluating a vendor based on the merits of what their product is capable of doing, or you're adding into that checklist, like, if it doesn't run on a Mac, it's out. Right. It's like, what if it's the only product that makes sense for your district? Are you really going to say no because the hardware doesn't support it, or do you accommodate the vendor with different hardware for those users?
And I think a lot of times, and I'm sure you'll have the same answer for this, but it's just, it's got to be based on value. I mean, if it's a fantastic software, but it only runs on PC and I'm a Mac district, I'll probably make it work, with some way of getting it done.
And what's your, just to, kind of part of the education process here for everybody listening.
Sure.
What does it look like for you? I mean, do you have like the secretaries or your administrators, do they get to pick? Do you give them some latitude on what they want to use?
That's a fantastic question. Sort of within a scope. So when I first started here, we were Windows. So this is my 12th year. And so we were Windows XP with a Novell network.
Nice.
And I knew nothing about Novell. And so I learned a little bit. And then there was a third-party company that was doing all the managed services. And then my second year, I asked them politely to leave and redid the entire Windows domain myself. So I set all that stuff up. And so we did Windows for a number of years. And then we switched over to Mac exclusively. And so that's been it was a bit of a struggle because everyone wanted to pull teeth, and then, you're Mac for 5 or 6 years, and then you go back to PC this last year.
Right.
It hasn't been so great going back because people just don't like change, which is something I always tend to undervalue. But as far as the principals and the administrators, they pretty much can have whatever they want. Our teachers, we are trying to get to one device, but it's just not working that well because I like to just have one thing to fix.
Sure.
So we're actually finding, now that we've been both and we can afford PC and Mac, I'm actually just running both currently. And so you can pretty much have whatever you want.
So this is so as we wrap up, I think that's a really interesting conversation. And I think the listeners that we have out there, if they're not really focused on the education space, this may not be as relevant. But I would say that even in the private sector, when you start talking about what are the users for organization X going to use, is it Windows, is it Mac, is it Linux, whatever it might be, is to remember that we're responsible for supporting the user first on the device second. And
Right.
So when I think about supporting a device for an end user, if they're not familiar with that operating system or that platform, then I have to start there. And so when I'm doing a vendor evaluation, especially when it's Windows, but even to some extent on the Apple side as well, it's like, okay, so if I get you the laptop, the MacBook Pro, as opposed to say a MacBook Air 2 years ago, you had a completely different hardware set that allowed for different accessories, it makes evaluating vendors really difficult, right? Because it's
Especially
like,
when you're multiple tiers inside the same vendor.
Even almost even worse, right? And then so like one of the things I'm dealing with right now is like we got iPads K5. Had I picked a different vendor platform, which would have probably worked just as smoothly in some respects, I'm going to just say that it would, even if for the argument here. Well, what's interesting is because of the generation of iPads happening the way they did, we did all in K5, all on the same model iPad, same case, same everything. We roll into this year, we're on year 2 of our lease, and lo and behold, Apple releases a new iPad that's a different size, and I can no longer get the previous sized iPad, and the cases don't fit, so it's a new style case. Well, you can't go in K5 and say, hey, you get the 10.2 inch screen and you get the 9.7 inch screen because Johnny's going to do more in life than you are.
Yep, it's a struggle, isn't it?
It absolutely is. And I think in hindsight, hindsight's always 2020, right?
Always.
I would have loved to do it differently, but I didn't get that opportunity. So now for me in vendor evaluation, it's like, and this was also on last week's, what's their roadmap? So if their roadmap says over the next 18 months, we'll have 3 product cycles, I probably am not as interested in working with them as I would be if they said, we have 6-month and 18-month, whatever software updates, but the hardware is not changing, so rapidly that I'm going to have equality issues in the classroom.
Right. We run into that all the time. Like I said, with the Apple devices where, you buy, we bought some the end of last year for K1 because we decided that it was a better device for K1 than Chromebooks. And we could argue that all day. And I truly think it is a better device for that particular grade level. And so we were able to get the 10.2s, but if I go to buy for, if we decide to do the rest of the elementary school, I'm going to get a different iPad for a different grade level. And, and just year in and year out, it's always whatever, whatever's new and whatever's coming out.
Of course it is. But that's part of that vendor evaluation. And I know we've
Yeah.
kind of stepped away from the security focus, but I think to circle back and wrap it up, security is part of that equation too, because as these devices change and as we're getting different models, I've noticed, particularly with Apple, you're now coming up against is it still supported? Or I shouldn't even just say Apple. I mean, I look at the Chromebook. I've got Chromebooks that are great devices. Hardware is rock solid.
Yep.
They probably, if they were PC operating system, they probably have another 2 years of life left in them. And I can't use them at all because I can't maintain the Chrome OS licensing.
Yeah, because they're outside of the 5-year window or whatever.
Which is an interesting model. And it kind of comes back to, well, maybe I need to be more vigilant on that 5-year cycle, regardless of who the vendor is.
Yeah, and that was something I've always tried to do here, is try to keep everything in a 5-year cycle. But, we got to the end of our staff Mac purchases would have been last year, and we were in really good shape with the ones that we had. And so we decided to ride another year. And so you kind of play that by, kicking the bag down the curb basically. But
so I would add one more bullet that I think is somewhat relevant, more so in education maybe than elsewhere, is in 3 years, in 4 years, what does the value left on the technology assets that we're acquiring look like? Do I cycle them out? Do I sell them? Those are tough decisions to make, because I think that is an area where we can easily get into a security compromise, because you have devices no longer supported, but the technology is solid. And so they're interspersed with the devices that are, and it's like, okay, now I've got a security management nightmare on my hands.
Right. You're dealing with OSs that are so different and so much older than the other ones.
So, John, this is the conclusion of this episode. Where can people find you?
On the internet, of course.
What?
I don't have any fancy things or anything.
You don't have a fancy handle?
No, I don't have a fancy handle. I can make one up though if you want.
John Saves Tech.
Absolutely. At gmail.org or something.
There you go. Gmail.org. Gmail, the nonprofit. Yeah.
Yeah. .nonprofit.com.us.
So what's your email address? So if people want to ping you.
Sure. It's just john.munford, MUNFORD @gmail.com.
Perfect. John, it's been great. I appreciate you being on the show today. For those of you listening, hope you had a great day and enjoy the rest of your week. We're out.
Thanks for having me, Chris. Take care.
You bet.